Hugh Hewitt. Representative Mike Gallagher is chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. He joins me this morning. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning. How are you, Hugh?
I have one word for you. Giannis.
Can't even pronounce it right, Hugh. It's Giannis. But listen, it was a rough exit for the Milwaukee Bucks. Okay, you don't need to rub it in my face. One
I
seed
didn't
loses
say
to
it.
an
I
eighth
just
seed.
he was inspiring. His exchange with the sports writer is an inspiring moment of humility in the face of crushing and agonizing defeat. There is no losing in sports. There is no crying in baseball. You need to know that in Wisconsin. There is no losing in sports because you're going to lose a lot in Green Bay this year. But just remember what Giannis said. There is no losing in sports.
It's very comforting
Because they sure
Although
look like they lost.
Green Green Bay had a fantastic draft, so we're feeling good. Everything's okay. It's going to be a great season. Don't worry about it.
All right, Chairman, let's get to this story. Matt Pottinger sends me something, I read it, right? Matt Pottinger is part of the Churchill clique, of which you're a member. That's the term that Goebbels gave to the people who were onto the Fuhrer early in the 30s. Matt said the headline is a Canadian intelligence report suggests Beijing meddled in the 2019 and 2021 campaign. It goes on to say significantly, maybe to the point of tipping the government to Justin Trudeau. Is this on the Select Committee's radar?
It is. Well, let me say a few specific things and then zoom out in terms of how I think about it. We also just had a report that the Canadian Intelligence Service confirmed that a Conservative MP in Canada, Michael Chong, was targeted by China, by the United Front Work Department, and by their intel agency after he condemned the Uyghur genocide. Him and his family were threatened, as well as the fact that the Canadian Intelligence Service sees China, assesses that China sees Canada as a high priority target, and they employ incentives and punishments as part of a vast network of influence directed at legislators, business executives, and members of the diaspora community. Additionally, Hugh, on the specifics, I would commend to you an open letter that appeared from from a group of Hong Kongers to Canadian government officials that really gets into, and I'll post this and send this to you. It gets into the nature of how the Chinese Communist Party wields their influence in order to infiltrate a country like Canada and affect their political process. They do so through Chinese Canadian community organizations that sound innocuous, but ultimately become vehicles for influence, coercion, and intelligence espionage. They do it through Chinese language media. They do it through Chinese social media, particularly WeChat, which is very popular among Chinese Canadians. And they do it through direct influencing of politicians and influential figures. And ultimately, anytime someone raises concerns about Chinese influence, they accuse them aggressively of racism in order to deflect that interference. So it is important for Americans to understand what's going on in Canada so that we take steps to prevent it from happening here. Zoom out to how the committee might tackle this. I view this, Hugh, as part of a broader effort to interfere in our hemisphere. I would call this something akin to the CCP's threat to the Monroe Doctrine. And it's not just happening which we take for granted, right? Because we live in broadly a secure hemisphere. It's not just happening in Canada. It's CCP influence in Central and Latin America. It's their extensive economic influence in the Panama Canal. It's all over South America. It's something we are not paying enough attention to. And so I would like to tackle this in a hearing or a series of events. We have members on the committee, Democrats and Republicans, Carlos Jimenez from Miami, Jake Auchincloss from Massachusetts, who are keened into this issue and want to tackle it. But it's happening on a scale that I think most Americans aren't aware of. And if we don't take steps to counter it now, something like this could happen in our own political system.
You know, Chairman Gallagher, I watched The Diplomat, the new series that stars the star of the series, The Americans. And I was thinking about The Americans. In the 80s, everyone was aware, and if you had classified access as I did in the 80s, you were very aware that the Soviets were in the country doing bad things. And they had East German proxies, and they had Cuban proxies, and they had a few other proxies. And they were in deep cover. Some of them were sleeper agents, cicadas as they're called, and slow horses, but they were everywhere. And we followed them around. We didn't arrest them. And we had warrants through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to follow them around. I haven't had a clearance since '89. I have no idea how vast is the attempt by the Chinese Communist Party to do what the Soviets did in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, which is to penetrate openly and not openly. And I'm concerned that, A, the Confucius Institutes have been outed, for example, but do we know even their open level of espionage, much less, you can't even talk about their closed level, I know, but it's vast. It makes the Soviet effort look like child's play.
Well, one thing also in the 80s and throughout the Cold War, the Soviet espionage apparatus penetrated the public consciousness in a way that the Chinese espionage apparatus hasn't, right? Your average person could tell you what the KGB was, whereas today, I don't think your average American knows what the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, is, nor do they know in particular what United Front work is. And that latter is really concerning to me because United Front work, as we've talked about before, is what Xi Jinping calls his magic weapon. It goes back to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a combination of traditional intelligence operations with influence operations and coercion, with co-opting elites in foreign societies. There's no clear analog in the United States, so it's hard for us to understand. And my concern is that even our own intelligence community does not yet have a sophisticated and deep understanding of United Front work. And that is really what we need to counter, because it's not just Confucius Institutes. It's these nonprofits, again, with harmless sounding names like the Chinese Student Scholars Association, which are then used to harass and surveil Taiwanese students or even Chinese students on American campuses. This is happening on American campuses. Similar story with the illicit police station that I went to in the heart of Manhattan. It was registered through a harmless sounding nonprofit, but is then used as a way to repress people on American soil. This is this new phenomenon of transnational repression, which is tied intimately to United Front work, which is why on the committee, and no committee in Congress is really tackling this issue, this is an area where we're trying to at first educate our colleagues, get them to understand what United Front work is through a series of United Front Work 101 products and presentations, and then educate the American people on what this is. And then third and finally, come up with a legislative agenda to counter United Front work. You could imagine, for example, Hugh, part of that legislative agenda would be tightening up our Foreign Agent Registration Act laws and our Lobbying Disclosure Act laws, which are also exploited to co-opt Americans into doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly on behalf of Chinese state-owned companies or Chinese national champions like Huawei and ZTE. And there we've seen instances of former members of Congress being willing to effectively lobby on behalf of these Chinese companies, which I don't think should be allowed at all, Hugh.
Now, Chairman Gallagher, I've got lots of Chinese American friends who are third, fourth, fifth generation Chinese Americans, no doubt whatsoever about their patriotism and loyalty. I've got many first generation Chinese Americans who emigrated to this country, no doubt about their patriotism and loyalty. But I also have a concern. I asked Matt Pottinger this. I don't want to ever encourage racist behavior or disparaging behavior towards Chinese or Chinese Americans or Chinese on green cards. I have a real concern about a Chinese national on a green card in the United States going to work for people without being vetted by the United States government, because we do not know what the CCP has on them in Beijing. Do you have that concern? And is there any way for an average American employer to say, I'd like to hire this Chinese national on a green card, but I don't want to hire a CCP spy or influenced individual? Is there any way to deal with that?
Well, you hinted at something critical that gets to how the CCP represses across borders and the nature of United Front work. You talked about a Chinese citizen working in the United States that might have family back in China. What we've seen time and time again, and what we saw in some of these cases in Canada, is that CCP entities will go to a person and say, hey, it would be a shame if something happened to your daughter back in Beijing or your elderly father. I mean, what does this look like, Hugh? This is pure mafia tactics. It's like, hey, nice family you got there. Shame if something would happen to them. That's how they're doing this across the world. And so we need to understand what's going on here. It's a mafia-like tactic, and the CCP in many cases is a mafia-like entity. It operates that way. Can a business have complete confidence? This is where we need the federal government and the intelligence community and the FBI in particular to up their game. We confronted this in the Trump administration when they rightly put in place a ban on Chinese military affiliated researchers on American campuses, which makes eminent sense. But for your colleges, they would say, well, how are we supposed to know who's Chinese military affiliated and who isn't? And I get that, right? Because our colleges are not, intelligence agencies, and they may not have the best understanding of the networks. That's where we need our law enforcement and our intelligence community to step up and be able to tease out the network of how a legitimate Chinese researcher may be connected to the United Front Work Department, may be connected back to the MSS, may be connected to the Chinese military. What I've found is that we have some incredible assets here in the United States and in allied countries like Australia. I would commend to you a researcher in Australia named Alex Josky, who just came out with a book that talks about the nature of the Chinese intelligence apparatus and how our entire theory of the case on China, this peaceful rise hypothesis, was actually the deliberate product of a Chinese intelligence operation. We also have a national treasure here named Peter Mattis, who's working with the Select Committee, who has written extensively about the nature of Chinese intelligence, and I think is our foremost expert here in the United States. And so we have assets we can draw upon, but we need the IC, the intelligence community, to develop that organic expertise and work proactively with the private sector and academia.
So I've talked to Miles Yu about this, another national treasure, maybe the most hated man by the Chinese Communist Party in the United States. And Miles has just told me, I don't have any idea of scope or scale. Do you think you've got your arms around it yet, Chairman Gallagher? We got less than a minute. Do you think you know how big the influence and espionage operation is?
Well, quite honestly, every time I think I do, I uncover something else that suggests the scope is bigger, the scale is bigger. I mean, the police station issue, the illegal police station, is a perfect example. This isn't just one incident in New York. It's over 100 locations across the globe. So the sheer size of this is shocking, which is why we need to tackle it with a sense of urgency. And I believe it's designed in many cases to create chaos in America and allied countries, to pit America against
well said,
America.
Chairman Gallagher. Follow him on Twitter at Rep Gallagher. My condolences about Giannis, but there is no losing in Wisconsin sports. Evidently, everybody gets a trophy in Wisconsin. Thank you, Chairman. I'll be right back, America.